The morning started the way every morning started. Miriam Calloway was at the kitchen counter by 6:15, measuring coffee into the filter the way she had measured coffee into filters for 4 decades. 2 scoops level, not heaping the way Douglas preferred. The kitchen faced east. In the spring and summer, the light came through the window above the sink at a low angle and lit up the whole room gold. In November, it came gray and thin, barely enough to see by. She didn't turn on the overhead light. She stood in the gray morning and listened to the coffee maker and looked at the backyard she had planted and replanted over the years. The flower beds were cut back for winter, the roses pruned down to their woody canes, the garden asleep under a thin skin of frost. She had done that pruning herself 2 weekends ago, the way she did every November. She knew every inch of that yard the way you know something you have tended for a very long time. 63 years old, 40 years in this house, 2 children raised in these rooms, thousands of mornings exactly like this one. She heard Douglas on the stairs. That was the first thing she noticed, the sound of his footsteps, which were different. Not heavy the way they usually were, the deliberate tread of a man who owned the floor he walked on. These were careful steps, considered. The footsteps of someone who had thought about what came next. Douglas appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was wearing a suit she did not recognize. That was the second thing. Miriam had been buying Douglas's clothes, or at minimum approving them, for most of their marriage. She knew his wardrobe the way she knew the garden, every piece, every season, the rotation of it. This suit was Italian wool charcoal with a faint stripe cut closer than anything Douglas had worn in 20 years. It made him look younger. It was not for her benefit that he was wearing it. She looked at him. He did not quite look at her. "We need to talk," he said. In 40 years of marriage, Miriam had learned to read her husband's voice the way a sailor reads weather. She knew the tone he used for household matters, for business discussions, for the rare arguments that blew up and then passed. This was none of those. This was a tone she had never heard from him before, and the fact that she had never heard it made her stomach drop before he said anything else. They sat in the living room. This detail would stay with Miriam long after everything else blurred. They sat in the living room she had decorated and redecorated over the years, the room where they had opened Christmas presents with Garrett and Cecily, where she had nursed Douglas through 2 bouts of flu, where they had sat together on the couch and watched the news on the night their first grandchild was born. She had chosen every piece of furniture in that room. She had repainted the walls 4 times, tracking the light, trying to get it right. Douglas sat in the armchair across from her, not beside her on the couch, across from her. The distance was small in feet and enormous in every other way, and they both understood it. He said, "I want a divorce." He said, "I've met someone who makes me feel alive again, someone who understands what I need." He said, "Her name is Sabrina." Miriam heard the words. She processed them the way you process a sound when you're not sure what you've heard, running it back, checking it against what you thought was real. 40 years of marriage, 2 children, 4 grandchildren, a life built room by room, year by year, out of the accumulated effort of 2 people. She asked who Sabrina was. Douglas said it didn't matter who Sabrina was. What mattered was that he was done. Then he said the thing that would live in Miriam's memory longer than any other sentence spoken in that room. "Look at yourself, Miri. You're 63 years old. You've become invisible. Sabrina makes me feel alive." She sat very still. Sabrina was 31 years old, the same age as Cecily, the same age as their daughter. Douglas was 67 and was leaving his wife of 40 years for a woman the age of their daughter, and he was telling Miriam in the living room she had built that she had become invisible. She thought about the soot she hadn't recognized, the new cologne she had noticed 3 months ago and told herself was a Christmas gift he'd bought early, the gym membership he'd taken out in the spring, the first in 15 years, the business trips that had multiplied the late evenings, the phone turned face down on the dinner table. She had noticed all of it. She had explained all of it away because 40 years of marriage creates a bedrock of trust, and she had stood on that bedrock and trusted. He had used that trust the way you use a foundation to build something on the top of it she was never meant to see. Douglas was already standing when she finished processing all of this. He was telling her his lawyer would be in touch. He was telling her he wanted her out of the house by end of the week. He was telling her she would be taken care of, that he wasn't cruel, that this was simply what had to happen. He walked out of the living room. She heard him in the front hall. She heard the door. Miriam sat in the room she had made and looked at the garden through the window and did not move for a very long time. The machinery of divorce is designed for efficiency, not for people. What followed in the weeks after that November morning had a quality of unreality that Miriam would later struggle to describe. Everything moved with bureaucratic speed, forms, hearings, depositions, the cold vocabulary of asset division, while she stood in the middle of it, feeling like someone watching a flood take apart a house she'd spent her life building. Douglas's legal team was formidable. This did not surprise her in retrospect. Douglas had always been good at preparation. Whatever else he was thorough. His lawyers were three people from a downtown Denver firm that specialized in high net worth divorce, and they had been working on this for months before Douglas sat across from her in the living room and said the words. The papers were already drafted. The strategy was already in place. Her lawyer was a court-appointed attorney named Mr. Greer, who handled too many cases and whose office smelled like old coffee and was stacked floor to ceiling with folders. He was not unkind. He was simply overwhelmed, and the gap between his preparation and the opposition's was the gap between a kitchen knife and a surgical instrument. The arguments against her were systematic and relentless. The house purchased with Douglas's income in Douglas's name. The retirement accounts accumulated from Douglas's career. The investment portfolio. Douglas's earnings. Douglas's decisions. Two vehicles titled in Douglas's name. The business he had spent 30 years building, his labor, his vision, his risk. Her contribution, in the language of Douglas's lawyers, was domestic in nature. She had raised the children, but that was a choice, not a career. She had managed the household, but that created no financial value, produced no income, contributed no assets. She had supported Douglas's professional life by managing everything else. But that was what wives did. Wasn't it? That was the arrangement they had agreed to. She had agreed to it. She had signed no contract stating otherwise. 40 years of being the person who made everything possible for someone else, rendered in legal language, amounted to negligible financial contribution to the marital estate. Miriam sat through the hearings and listened to this and felt the peculiar nausea of watching something true be made to sound like nothing. She had known this was the risk of the life she had chosen. She had known it abstractly, the way you know that roads are dangerous while driving on them every day without thinking about it. She had never imagined actually living the consequence. Their children tried to stay neutral. This was its own specific pain. Garrett and Cecily both called, both expressed love. Both were careful not to say anything that could be held against them by either parent. They were good children. They were also busy adults with their own lives, their own children, their own complicated feelings about watching their parents' marriage dismantled publicly. Their neutrality was not malice, it was survival. But survival from inside Miriam's position felt like abandonment, even when she understood it wasn't. She navigated most of it alone. The morning of the final hearing was gray and cold, in the way that Denver gets in late November. Not the dramatic cold of a mountain town, but the flat, penetrating cold of a city that has given up on warmth until March. Miriam dressed carefully. She had always dressed carefully. 40 years of hosting Douglas's clients and colleagues had made presentation reflexive. She wore the charcoal pantsuit she'd bought 2 years ago for his firm's anniversary dinner. She did her hair. She put on the pearl earrings she'd had since their 25th anniversary. She sat on one side of the courtroom with Mr. Greer. Douglas sat on the other side with his 3 lawyers and with Sabrina. This was Miriam's first time seeing Sabrina in person. She was everything the word suggested, young, polished, effortlessly put together in the way of someone who has not yet had to work at it. She wore a dress that was appropriate for a courtroom and still managed to make a statement. She sat close to Douglas with the ease of someone who had long since stopped thinking about where she was allowed to sit. She touched his arm once lightly during a recess, and he leaned slightly toward her without thinking about it, the way bodies move toward warmth. Miriam looked at this and felt herself become very still inside. The judge read through the settlement with the efficiency of someone who had seen 10 of these before breakfast. The house Douglas. The retirement account split, but weighted significantly toward Douglas. The investment portfolio. Douglas. The vehicles Douglas. Alimony 5 years, a monthly figure that would allow Miriam to live modestly in a rental apartment somewhere and not much else. And then, almost as an afterthought, presented by Douglas's lead attorney in the same tone used to read a footnote, one additional property. A cabin in the mountains west of Denver. inherited by Douglas from his father approximately 20 years prior. Currently vacant, no utility connections, no active maintenance, in a state of significant disrepair. Appraised value negligible. The attorney said Douglas was willing to deed this property to Miriam, a gesture of goodwill. Miriam's attorney looked at her questioningly. She had nothing left to consider. She said, "Fine." The gavel came down. 40 years ended. She gathered her bag and walked toward the courtroom door. And as she reached it, she heard Douglas's voice behind her, not loud, not shouting, pitched just precisely enough to carry to her ears. "Enjoy the mountains, Miri. Try not to freeze." Sabrina's laugh was brief and quiet. Miriam did not stop walking, did not slow down, did not turn her head. She went through the door and down the corridor and through the glass doors of the building and into the cold parking lot. And she found her car, her old car, the one she had kept because it was paid off and she could not afford to replace it. And she got inside and she sat there. The parking lot was half empty. Someone was walking a dog on the sidewalk across the street. A delivery truck idled at the corner. Normal life proceeding, normally entirely indifferent to the fact that 40 years of another life had just been reduced to a footnote in a condemned cabin. Miriam Calloway sat in her car in the parking lot of the courthouse and cried. She had not cried since the morning Douglas said, "We need to talk." She had been operating on a kind of controlled numbness for weeks, moving through the legal proceedings with the focused dissociation of a person who understands that feeling things fully will have to wait until there is time for it. Now there was time. She cried for a long time. And then when it was done, she sat in the silence and noticed what remained after the grief moved through her. Anger. Not the hot, chaotic anger of someone who has been surprised. Something cleaner than that. A cold, structural anger, the anger of a person who has been given an accurate accounting of what the world thinks she is worth and has decided that the accounting is wrong. She sat with it for a moment, then she started the car. The calls from her children came that evening. Garrett first, her son, 35, an engineer in Colorado Springs, careful and measured in everything, including his emotions. He expressed concern. He offered his guest room. He said temporarily, which was honest, and she appreciated the honesty, even while it landed exactly as it was. Cecily called an hour later, her daughter, 32, a teacher in Fort Collins, more direct than her brother. She said, "Mom, I'm so sorry." She said, "We have a spare room, you know that." She said, "Dad said the cabin is basically falling apart," which was probably an understatement. She said the word probably and left the rest of the sentence for Miriam to finish. Miriam told them both the same thing. "I have the cabin. I'm going to go stay there for a while and figure things out." Cecily said, "Mom, that place is basically a ruin. Dad said it's been abandoned for years." Miriam said, "Then it will suit me just fine." She heard the pause that followed, the pause of a daughter trying to decide how much to push back on a mother who has used that tone before. Cecily knew the tone. It was the tone that meant the decision had been made, and the conversation was now about logistics, not choices. She drove north the next morning to clear out her things from the house Douglas had already effectively reclaimed. He was elsewhere. She did not ask where, did not want to know. She moved through the rooms she had spent 40 years making into a home and took what fit in her car. Clothes, the photographs, the cast iron skillet her mother had given her, a lamp from the bedroom that she had chosen herself 30 years ago at a shop that no longer existed. She left everything else. She did not look at the garden as she backed out of the driveway. The drive west took 3 hours on a good day. Miriam made it in a little over 3.5, slowed by roadwork outside of Conifer. And by the way, the roads changed as she climbed two-lane highway, becoming county, road, becoming gravel, becoming a rutted track through scrub, oak, and lodgepole pine that her sedan was not quite designed for. She almost missed the turnoff entirely. A wooden sign, gray and splitting, nailed to a pine tree at the edge of a narrow opening in the brush. The words were barely legible: "Calloway property, no trespassing." She sat with the engine running and looked at it. No trespassing. She was the property owner now. Her name was on the deed. And she felt, looking at that sign, exactly like what it said: someone who was not supposed to be here, who had arrived somewhere she had no clear right to, carrying nothing but a legal document and the remnants of a life that had been systematically disassembled over the past month. She turned onto the track. The drive through the trees took another 10 minutes. The track wound through dense forest, crossing a small creek on a plank bridge that flexed alarmingly under the car's weight, climbing a gradual rise before opening into a clearing of perhaps half an acre. And there it was. Miriam stopped the car and left the engine running and sat looking at her inheritance. The cabin was small, perhaps 800 square feet on a single floor with a loft. Log construction, which meant it had good bones and absolutely nothing else going for it. The porch across the front had collapsed on the right side, the boards rotted through, and the roof beams sagging to meet them at a steep wrong angle. 3 of the windows on the ground floor were missing their glass entirely, the frames open to whatever weather chose to enter. The roof, she could see from where she sat that the ridgeline had a sag in the middle, which meant water had been getting in for years, which meant what was inside was worse than what she could see from outside. Vines covered the south wall completely, the kind of woody gripping vine that takes years to establish and systematically destroys whatever it grows on. The clearing around the structure had gone entirely to seed waist-high grass and scrub brush pressing in from all sides. Douglas had called it dilapidated. Douglas had been generous. Miriam sat in her car for 2 full minutes looking at it. She thought about Garrett's guest room. She thought about Cecily's spare room with the floral wallpaper and the twin bed, and the sensation of being a guest in her own children's lives, tolerated with love, a temporary installation, a problem being managed. She thought about Douglas's voice in the parking lot of the courthouse. Try not to freeze. She turned off the engine. The mountain air when she opened the car door hit her like something physical, cold and sharp, scented with pine resin and creek water, and the particular clean of high altitude that carries no trace of traffic or exhaust or the smell of other people's lives. After weeks of courtrooms and lawyers' offices and the recycled air of other people's arguments, the cold hit her lungs like a correction. She stood beside her car and looked at the ruin and breathed. The silence was immense. No traffic, no neighbors, no hum of appliances or distant television or the ambient noise of a neighborhood that is always quietly in motion. Just wind in the pines and somewhere below the clearing, the sound of the creek moving over rocks in the dark. After months of noise, the noise of a marriage ending, of legal proceedings, of her own thoughts running in endless circles, the silence felt like something she hadn't known she was starving for. She tested the porch steps before putting her weight on them. The center of the first step held. The second, the third at the far left where the porch was still level held as well. The door was locked with a padlock so rusted it barely qualified as a lock, and the wood around the hasp had softened enough that it came free with 3 firm pulls. The smell was the first thing. Mold, which was expected. Animal something had denned in here maybe more than one thing over the course of years. Old wood and old damp, and the particular closed-in odor of a space that has been sealed against fresh air for so long that it has developed its own atmosphere. She clicked on her flashlight and looked at the interior. The cabin was one main room with a small kitchen alcove along the back wall, a stone fireplace on the left side that appeared structurally intact, and a sleeping loft reached by a fixed ladder on the right side. The floor was pine board original to the structure and had heaved and rotted in several places near the walls where water had been coming in through the damaged roof and running down the logs. The walls were covered in what had been whitewashed plaster, now dark with moisture and black in the lower corners, with mold that had been there long enough to establish itself permanently. Debris covered everything, old newspapers, leaves, and dirt blown in through the missing windows, evidence of the animals that had made temporary homes here over the years. The fireplace was solid. That was something. Miriam stood in the center of the room and turned slowly and looked at all of it. She thought about the living room she had spent 40 years making beautiful. She thought about the gardens she had planted and tended and pruned back every November for 4 decades. She thought about Douglas in his new suit sitting across the room from her, choosing the distance. She thought, fine. Fine then. She walked back to her car in the cold twilight and opened the trunk and pulled out her sleeping bag and her duffel and her headlamp, and she brought them inside. She could not heat the space. There was no wood cut, and the flue would need to be checked before she used the fireplace. She could not cook. The camp stove was in the car, and she would deal with that tomorrow. The light from her headlamp threw long shadows across the ruined floor and lit up 40 years of abandonment with a flat, merciless clarity. She cleared a section of floor near the fireplace, sweeping debris to the side with her boot. She unrolled the sleeping bag. She sat down on it and looked at the room around her, at the gap where the windows were, at the black patches of mold at the ceiling above the loft where she could see a slice of November sky through a gap in the roofing. She sat there for a long time. The cold worked its way in steadily, methodical the way mountain cold always is, not a sudden assault, but a patient claiming of all available warmth. She pulled the sleeping bag up around her shoulders. She thought about everything she had lost in the past month. The house, the garden, the life she had built and maintained and believed was solid. The 40 years of being someone's wife and someone's mother, and the person who kept everything running, who managed the details that made the bigger things possible, who was so thoroughly present in every room that she had somehow become invisible in all of them. The anger was still there. Below the grief and the exhaustion and the cold, it was still burning quietly, clean and steady like a pilot light. Try not to freeze. She lay down and closed her eyes and listened to the wind in the pines outside. In the morning, she decided she would begin. She was 63 years old. She had nowhere to be, nothing to lose, and a ruined cabin in the Colorado mountains. It was, she thought, as she drifted towards sleep in the cold and the dark, possibly the most freedom she had ever had in her life. She intended to use it. The first morning announced itself without ceremony. No alarm, no coffee maker, no sound of Douglas moving through the house above her. Just the gray light coming through the empty window frames and the cold that had worked its way into the sleeping bag during the night and settled in her lower back with the particular persistence of mountain air that has had hours to do its work. Miriam lay still for a moment and looked at the ceiling. The gap she had seen the night before, the one that showed a slice of sky through the damaged roofing, had grown slightly more visible in the morning light. A thin line of pale gray against darker wood, not large enough to let in rain directly, but large enough to let in cold, and large enough to let in whatever came after cold if she did nothing about it. She sat up. She had slept in her clothes, which was not something she had done since a camping trip with the children in 1994, and the stiffness in her joints reminded her in considerable detail that she was not the person who had taken that camping trip. She was 30 years further from that person than she wanted to think about at 6 in the morning on a floor in Colorado with no heat and no coffee. She stood up anyway. That was the first decision. It sounds small. It was not small. It was the decision that all subsequent decisions would grow from, the way a tree grows from the singular event of a seed putting down its first root. She stood up in the cold and the gray light, and she looked at the room around her. The mold, the debris, the rotted floor sections, the gaping windows, and she made the choice that she would not sit back down. She got her camp stove from the car. She heated water for instant coffee and drank it standing in the clearing in the cold, looking at the cabin from the outside with the evaluating eye of someone trying to understand the scope of a problem. The scope was considerable. But scope, she decided, was just another word for work, and work was something she understood. The town was called Harwick. It sat 40 minutes down the mountain on a 2-lane county road that followed the creek through a series of tight curves before opening onto a wider valley. Population perhaps 800, maybe 1,000, counting the ranches and properties scattered through the surrounding hills. One general store, one gas station, a diner called Patsy's that appeared to have been in continuous operation since approximately 1962, a hardware and supply store called Harwick True Value that occupied a low building at the edge of town with a hand-painted sign above the door. Miriam went there first. The man behind the counter was somewhere in his late 60s, thick through the chest and shoulders with a gray beard, trimmed close and reading glasses pushed up on his forehead. His name tag said Vern in block letters. He looked up when she came in and nodded the way people in small hardware stores nod, acknowledging not intrusive. She had made a list the night before by headlamps sitting on her sleeping bag. It was a long list. She worked through it at the counter: industrial mold cleaner, a respirator mask rated for chemical work, heavy work gloves, a pry bar, extra flashlight, batteries, a box of contractor trash bags, tarps, roofing tape for temporary repairs, a stiff brush, a caulking gun, caulk for the window frames, a hatchet for splitting wood when she got to that, fire starter, a box of waterproof matches. Vern watched her go through the list without comment, pulling items from the shelves and setting them on the counter. When she reached the roofing tape, he said, "What gauge is the existing roofing?" She told him what she had seen. He suggested a particular weight. He was right. She would figure that out later. When she had everything on the counter, he looked at the pile and then at her and said simply, "Big project." "Yes," she said. He did not ask what kind of project. He did not ask if she had help coming, or if she was sure she knew what she was doing, or any of the other questions she had braced for from a man in a hardware store looking at a woman her age buying what she was buying. He ran the items through the register and packed them in boxes and helped her carry them to her car. As she was pulling out of the lot, he raised one hand in the uncomplicated way of someone who expects you to come back and isn't making a production of it. She did come back. Many times. Vern became, without either of them exactly deciding this, a reliable source of practical information in a situation that required a great deal of it. YouTube was her other teacher. She had used it before for recipes, occasionally for household things, how to unclog a drain, how to repot an orchid. She had never used it for anything that required sustained physical labor, because she had never needed to. There had always been someone to call: a plumber, a handyman, Douglas's preferred contractor, who handled anything structural. There was no one to call now. She learned to assess roof damage by looking for the water stains on the interior ceiling and tracing them back to their source. She learned the difference between rot that was surface level and rot that had compromised structural integrity, which mattered because one could be cleaned and painted over, and one meant the wood had to come out entirely. She learned that mold remediation required not just cleaning, but sealing the source of moisture that had allowed the mold to establish itself, and that doing one without the other was like bailing a boat without finding the leak. She learned these things by watching people explain them on a phone screen, propped against a paint can, pausing and rewinding, taking notes on a yellow legal pad she'd bought at the general store. Then she went and did them. The first week was about establishing baseline conditions, making the space livable enough to work from. She sealed the window openings with plastic sheeting and roofing tape to stop the wind and the weather from continuing to enter. She swept the debris from the floor and bagged it. She got the fireplace flue open and clean enough to use safely, which involved climbing onto the roof with a wire brush and a flashlight and doing things she would not have been able to describe to her former self without her former self refusing to believe her. She cut and split wood from a downed pine at the edge of the clearing. This took her an entire afternoon to accomplish what she suspected a person with more upper body strength could have done in an hour. Her palms blistered. The next morning they hurt in a particular way that made her understand why people wore gloves, which she was now doing. She did not stop. The second week she started on the mold. She worked in the respirator mask, which was uncomfortable and claustrophobic and completely non-negotiable. The industrial cleaner Vern had recommended was effective and unforgiving. It required gloves, ventilation, and careful application. She scrubbed walls for hours at a stretch, stopping when her arms gave out eating lunch, standing up because sitting down felt like a negotiation with stopping, and she wasn't ready to negotiate. Her body adapted in ways she hadn't expected and hadn't asked for. The first week, her back had ached every morning with the specific protest of a person asking muscles to do things they'd forgotten how to do. By the second week, the protest was quieter. By the third, she was waking up sore but functional, the difference between a body complaining and a body adjusting. She lost weight she hadn't been trying to lose. She hadn't been eating much, not from discipline, just from the combination of hard work and the fact that elaborate cooking wasn't possible on a camp stove. Simple food, enough of it, nothing extra. Her clothes started to fit differently. She noticed this without particularly caring about it. There were more pressing things to pay attention to. It was during the second week on a Tuesday afternoon that she found the wall. She had been working in the kitchen alcove, the area in the back corner of the main room, where a wood-burning cook stove had once stood, the stove itself long gone, the space now occupied by evidence of the animal that had lived here most recently. She was caulking the gap between the baseboard and the floor, where cold air was coming in, when she knocked her knuckles against the wall above to check the condition of the lower boards. The sound was wrong. She knocked again more deliberately. The wall rang hollow, not the solid thud of wood and plaster over log structure, but a thin resonant sound. She knocked the adjacent section of wall to the right. Solid. Back to the hollow section. Hollow again, running perhaps 3 feet wide. Miriam set down the caulking gun and looked at the wall. She had been in enough old buildings in the past 3 weeks to know that unexpected things existed inside them. But this was not a settling crack or an air pocket in old plaster. This was a deliberate space. The boards here were subtly different from the boards around them, a slightly different tone to the wood, the grain running in a slightly different direction, installed at some point after the original construction, and then painted over to match. Someone had built a false wall. She went to get the pry bar. The wood was old, and the moisture had worked into it over the decades, which meant it came apart with less resistance than she expected. She worked the bar into the gap at the edge of the paneling and applied steady pressure, and the boards gave way in pieces, the nails pulling free of the softened wood behind them, with sounds like small, reluctant confessions. Behind the false wall was a space, roughly 2 feet deep, running from floor to ceiling, perhaps 3 feet wide. The interior of the space was drier than anything else in the cabin, sealed as it had been behind the paneling from the moisture that had penetrated everywhere else. The floor of the space was bare wood. The walls were the original log construction, and on the floor of the space, centered as if placed with care, sat a box. It was cedar. Roughly the size of a large shoebox, the wood darkened with age, but intact cedar being naturally resistant to the insects and moisture that had destroyed so much else in this building. It sat in the dry dark of the hidden space, the way things sit when they have been waiting for a long time without any particular expectation of being found. Miriam set the pry bar against the wall. She picked up her flashlight and crouched down and looked at the box without touching it for a moment. Someone had put this here deliberately, had built a false wall around it, had done so carefully enough that the false wall had stood for decades without giving itself away, until a woman with a pry bar and no other options had started dismantling things. She picked up the box. It was heavier than she expected. She carried it to the work table she had set up in the center of the main room, a piece of plywood on 2 sawhorses, and set it under the portable work light she'd been using in the evenings. The lid was fitted, not hinged, the kind of lid that slides into a groove and is held in place by the precision of its fit. It had swollen slightly with the years, but came free with careful pressure. Inside, a cloth bag and a bundle of papers wrapped in oilcloth, the kind of heavy wax cloth that had been used for waterproofing long before plastic existed, and that had done its job well enough that what was inside it had survived the century plus since someone put it there. She unwrapped the papers first. They were old in a way that old documents are old, not fragile exactly, but with a quality of age that made her handle them carefully. The handwriting on the top sheet was formal, the penmanship of a different era, precise, deliberate, slanted with the particular character of a hand trained by someone who believed handwriting mattered. She read. She read the first page and then the second, and then she sat down on the wooden stool she'd brought in from the barn and read them again from the beginning. What she held in her hands was a mineral claim filed with the state of Colorado in 1875. The property at this location, her property, this clearing, this ground she had been walking on for 3 weeks, had been registered as a mineral claim in the name of one Elias Brandt, identifying a natural hot spring discovered on the land the previous year, 1874. The filing documented that samples of the water had been analyzed by an assayer in Denver and found to contain elevated concentrations of sulfate minerals, magnesium, calcium, and bicarbonate compounds consistent with deep geothermal origin and associated in the medical literature of the period with therapeutic properties for conditions of the joints and skin. The subsequent pages were a development plan. Not a vague intention, a real plan, with architectural drawings in the same precise hand as the filing documents. A bathhouse structure designed to enclose and provide access to the spring, private soaking rooms, an attendance station, a reception area in the style of the mineral spa resorts that had been operating in Europe for 2 centuries and were beginning to appear in the American West as the railroad opened the mountains to the kind of visitor who traveled for health as much as for scenery. There were letters from potential investors, 2 men in Denver who had expressed serious interest, specific figures discussed, a projected timeline for construction, and then at the bottom of the stack, a single page in a different hand, older the penmanship, less steady, the ink slightly different in color, as if written with a different instrument at a different time. Development of the spring postponed indefinitely. Economic conditions following the financial crisis of 1873 have made investment in new ventures impossible for the foreseeable future. This claim and all associated documents retained against future circumstances. It is my intention to return to this project when conditions allow. No signature, no date beyond the implied sense of something written in the late 1870s by a man who expected to come back to it. He had not come back to it. The property had passed through several owners in the century plus that followed, each transfer moving the land further from anyone who had known, What Elias Brandt had known when he built his false wall and put his cedar box inside it. Douglas had inherited it from his father, who had inherited it from a chain of men who had called it worthless, without ever looking at what worthless meant. She opened the cloth bag. Inside, rock samples, several of them each wrapped separately in cloth and labeled in the same formal handwriting as the filing documents. Water samples in small glass vials sealed with wax still intact, the kind of physical evidence a meticulous man collects because he understands that claims require proof. Miriam sat at her work table in the light of the work lamp and held a glass vial of water from 1874 and looked at it for a long time. Douglas had given her this. He had given it to her as a joke, as a final diminishment, as the physical expression of his opinion of what she was worth. Here, take the worthless thing, take the trash, take the ruin. She set the vial down carefully. She picked up her phone and searched for the nearest place with reliable internet. Patsy's Diner in Harwick had Wi-Fi. She had been in there twice for coffee. She would go tomorrow. That night, sitting by the fire, she had learned to build correctly. Miriam read through the documents again from the beginning. She read them the way she had once read contracts for Douglas's business when he had asked her to look them over in the early years, carefully, systematically noting what mattered. What mattered was this: the spring was documented. The mineral analysis was documented. The claim was filed. If the spring still existed, if it was still active after all this time, she had historical documentation of its existence and its properties going back 150 years. The question was whether the spring still existed. She would have to find it. She spent most of January looking. The documents described the location in the language of 1870s, surveying distances from landmarks that no longer existed, bearings from a reference point. She couldn't identify a description of the terrain that matched the general character of the property, but not any specific features she could pin to a spot on the ground. She walked the 20 acres systematically in a grid in the cold. She wore the heaviest layers she owned and the waterproof boots she'd bought at the general store in Harwick, and she went out every morning and walked until the light went or the cold drove her in, whichever came first. She found nothing the first week. Or rather, she found what 20 acres of Colorado mountain terrain contains in January snow rock pine, the creek along the eastern boundary running low and cold under its partial skin of ice. She found the tracks of deer in what she thought was a coyote, and once at the far northwest corner of the property near a granite outcropping, the rounded depression that suggested something had been digging recently. She investigated and found nothing but the explanation for why the marmots had been so scarce. The second week of looking, she found the thermal area. She had walked this section of the property before. A small clearing, perhaps 60 feet across, sheltered on three sides by dense pine. She had walked through it twice and noted it and moved on. But on this particular morning, crossing from the western tree line toward the creek, she saw something that stopped her. A circle of bare ground, roughly 10 feet across, centered in the clearing. Not bare from wind or animal activity, the surrounding ground had 4 inches of snow from 2 days ago. This circle was clean. The snow had melted from it as if the ground beneath it was generating warmth, leaving a ring of wet, dark earth surrounded by white. Miriam walked toward it slowly. She could feel the difference before she reached it. The air just above the bare circle was fractionally warmer than the surrounding air. Not dramatically, not the blast of heat from a vent, but the subtle warmth of something active just below the surface. She crouched at the edge of the bare circle and pressed her palm flat against the ground. Warm, not hot. Warm the way a living thing is warm. She had brought a short-handled shovel with her. She had started carrying it after the second day of searching, the way you carry things you might need when you don't know what you'll find. She set it against the ground at the edge of the circle and began to dig. The first foot was cold, compacted soil with small rocks. The second foot was darker, softer, with the quality of ground that has been wet from below for a long time. When she hit the third foot, water began to seep into the hole. Not flooding, not a rush, but a steady welling up from below, and the water was warm. She put her hand in it. The warmth went up her fingers and into her palm, and she knelt in the snow in a Colorado clearing in January and held her hand in water that had been moving through the deep rock of these mountains for longer than anyone alive could account for. And something happened to her that she could not have predicted and could not afterward entirely describe. She had been holding herself together for months with the particular discipline of someone who understands that falling apart is a luxury she cannot afford right now. She had been angry, which was useful, and she had been exhausted, which was inevitable, and she had been working, which was necessary. She had not allowed herself to feel much else because much else would have stopped her. But kneeling in the snow with her hand in warm water, with the cedar box's documents in the cabin behind her, and 40 years of discarded life behind that, and the whole improbable chain of events that had led her here, she pressed her other hand against the ground and bowed her head and cried. Not the grief of the courthouse parking lot. Something different. Something that felt like relief so complete it had no language. Like a rope she had been holding for a very long time had finally been anchored to something. She stayed like that for a while. Then she sat back on her heels and looked at the hole she had dug, and the water welling up in it, and the steam rising faintly in the January air. And she began to think about what came next. What came next required internet access, which required Patsy's Diner, which had become her office by default. She sat in the same booth by the window every time, the one that got the afternoon light, and was far enough from the counter that she could spread papers without feeling like she was in anyone's way. Patsy herself never asked what she was working on. She refilled the coffee without being asked and otherwise left Miriam alone, which was exactly right. Miriam researched for 3 weeks. She researched mineral springs and their development, the geology, the chemistry, the regulatory requirements for water testing and classification, the permitting process for a commercial bathing facility in Colorado. She researched historical preservation, what constituted a historically significant property, what documentation was required, what organizations provided funding for the restoration of sites with documented historical value. She researched spa resort economics, which she found both encouraging and sobering. Natural mineral spring resorts generated significant revenue when developed and managed well. They also required capital engineering, studies, environmental impact assessment, construction permits, staffing, marketing. The distance between the spring she had found and a functioning business was measured in years and money she did not have. What she did find, what mattered in those 3 weeks of research, was the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund, a state program. Relatively small focus specifically on properties with documented historical significance that had fallen out of use or into disrepair. Not large grants, but enough to commission the studies needed to establish a property's value and enough to begin restoration work if the historical case was strong. She downloaded the application. She read it twice. She filled it out once, got halfway through, and threw it away. The form was designed for organizations, historical societies, preservation, nonprofits, municipal agencies with grant writers on staff. It asked for things she didn't have: letters of support from institutional partners, preliminary environmental assessments, documentation of organizational capacity. She was a single woman living in a cabin with a camp stove and a pry bar. She did not have organizational capacity. She had documents from 1875 and a hole in the ground that was warm. She requested 2 other grant programs the same week. Both sent rejection letters within 2 weeks. Standard language: not a fit for current funding priorities. Best of luck with your project. She sat in the booth at Patsy's and looked at the rejection letters and drank her coffee. Garrett called that evening. He had seen something on social media, Douglas and Sabrina, in a restaurant in Aspen, tagged in a friend's photo. He mentioned it the way you mention something you feel the other person should know, carefully in the middle of a longer conversation about other things, hoping it wouldn't land too hard. It landed, not because she still wanted Douglas. She had stopped wanting Douglas with a clarity and completeness that had surprised her. But because Aspen meant money and ease, and the life that had been built on 40 years of her work and had then been redistributed as if she had never been part of it. He was in Aspen with a 31-year-old woman, and she was in a cabin in Harwick with 2 rejection letters and a hole in the ground. That night, she sat by the fire for a long time. She took out the cedar box and looked at the documents again. She looked at the architectural drawings for the bathhouse, the careful lines of a man who had believed in something enough to draw it out precisely. She looked at the water samples in their wax-sealed vials. Elias Brandt had believed in this land. He had documented it with care. He had built a false wall and hidden his evidence and written a note saying he would return. He had never returned. She was not going to make the same mistake. She got out her legal pad and her pen. She did not write a grant application. She wrote a letter. She addressed it to the director of the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund by name, which she had found on the organization's website. She used a salutation, "Dear Ms. Aldridge," and she wrote in the same plain direct prose she had always used when she wanted to be understood rather than impressive. She wrote about the cabin. She wrote about the false wall and the cedar box in the documents from 1875. She wrote about Elias Brandt and his plan and the Panic of 1873 and the note at the bottom of the stack. She wrote about spending 3 weeks searching 20 acres in January and kneeling in the snow with her hand in warm water. She wrote, "I am 63 years old. I was handed this property in a divorce settlement. As an afterthought, my ex-husband's lawyers described it as having negligible value. They were wrong. I don't have organizational capacity or institutional partners or a letter of support from anyone. What I have is a cedar box from 1875 and a spring that has been waiting for 150 years for someone to pay attention to it. I am paying attention to it. I am asking you to help me do something worthy of what's here." She read it back. It was honest. It was specific. It was the truth. She folded it and put it in an envelope with copies of the key documents from the miter box, the mineral claim, filing the analysis, the development plan, and she mailed it the next morning from the Harwick post office. Then she went back to work. She had no idea if the letter would produce anything. She had no plan for what happened if it didn't. She had the equivalent of a pilot light where certainty should have been not enough to see by, just enough to keep going. 14 days later, her phone rang. She was on the roof applying a second layer of roofing tape over a particularly stubborn section of damaged flashing, and she almost didn't answer because she was at a point in the work that required both hands. She answered anyway, wedging the phone against her shoulder. The voice on the other end was a woman named Aldridge, Margaret Aldridge, director of the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund. She had a direct, unhurried way of speaking that Miriam recognized as the voice of someone who had learned which things were worth taking time over. Ms. Aldridge said she had read Miriam's letter 3 times. She said she had shown it to 2 colleagues. She said the documentation from the cedar box was, in her professional assessment, among the most complete historical records she had encountered for a private mineral spring property in the state of Colorado. She said the fund was prepared to offer a grant, not a fortune, but enough to commission a geological assessment of the spring, enough for a formal historical designation application, enough to begin the stabilization and restoration work that would make the rest possible. She said, "Mrs. Callaway, we don't only fund buildings. We fund stories that deserve to be preserved. Yours qualifies on both counts." Miriam sat on the roof of her cabin in the February cold with the phone against her ear, and the mountains spread out in every direction and a stretch of blue sky above them that went all the way to the edge of the world. She said thank you. She stayed on the roof for a while after the call ended, not working, just sitting. She had written a letter. She had told the truth. Someone had listened. She understood the beginning of something she had not yet been able to fully imagine. But the beginning was real, and it was hers, and it had started in a false wall, in a ruined kitchen, in a cedar box, in the warm seep of water through winter ground. She climbed down off the roof. There was a great deal of work ahead. She had always been good at work. She picked up her tools and got started. The grant money arrived in March. Not a dramatic arrival. A letter from the Colorado Historical Preservation Fund with a check enclosed and a set of conditions and reporting requirements that Miriam read twice at the kitchen table she had built herself from lumber, bought at the Harwick True Value. The table was not elegant. It was level and solid, and she had made it, which was more than she could say for most of the furniture she had owned in the previous 40 years. She sat at it with the check in her hand for a while. Then she made a list. This was how she had always operated in the years before Douglas, in the years during Douglas, and now in the years that were assembling themselves into something she didn't yet have a name for. Lists were how you took something overwhelming and made it into something sequential. Sequential things could be accomplished one at a time. She had learned this in the first weeks in the cabin, and she was not going to forget it. The list had 3 columns: what needed to be done, who needed to do it, and what it would cost. She filled in the first column herself. For the second and third, she drove to Harwick and used the Wi-Fi at Patsy's. She hired a geological survey firm out of Colorado Springs. She hired an architectural firm that specialized in historical preservation, A small practice run by a woman named Deirdre who had worked on mining era structures across the Mountain West and who came out to the property on a cold March morning and walked the 20 acres and crouched at the edge of the thermal circle and pressed her palm to the ground, the same way Miriam had pressed hers, and looked up with an expression that confirmed what Miriam already knew. She hired a local contractor named Pruitt, mid-40s, methodical, recommended by Vern, at the hardware store with the particular economy of recommendation that meant he was trustworthy rather than spectacular. Pruitt arrived with two workers and looked at the cabin from the outside and then from the inside and made notes on a clipboard without commenting on the condition of things. Miriam liked him immediately for this. What followed was 6 months of work that was different in character from the first months of solitary survival, but not easier. It was collaborative work, coordinated work, the kind that required her to make decisions every day about things she was still learning. The geological survey confirmed what the 1875 documents had claimed: the spring was a legitimate thermal mineral feature fed by deep geothermal water, the mineral profile consistent with springs that had been used therapeutically in Europe and the American West for well over a century. The water temperature at the source was a steady 94 degrees Fahrenheit. The flow rate was low but consistent, not adequate for industrial use, perfectly adequate for a small bathing facility. Deirdre designed the bathhouse to follow the 1875 drawings as closely as modern building codes permitted. This meant a timber frame structure, small 3 private soaking rooms, a dressing area, a reception space with a wood stove, historically proportioned windows. Materials that matched the character of the era. It was not large. It was not meant to be. It was meant to be what the original plans had intended: a place where the specific qualities of this specific water could be experienced with care and privacy. The cabin itself, Pruitt's crew addressed methodically. New roofing properly done, subfloor replacement in the sections that had rotted through, insulation and weatherproofing, electrical wiring run to a small generator setup, while the permitting for a utility connection worked its way through the county system. The stone fireplace, which had turned out to be the soundest structure in the original building, was cleaned and repointed and left exactly as it was. Miriam worked alongside all of it, not in the way of a property owner who makes occasional appearances to check progress and express opinions. She was there every day, early and late, doing whatever needed doing alongside whoever needed a hand. She learned to read architectural drawings well enough to catch a discrepancy between the plan and the installation. She learned enough about electrical work to know when a question needed to be asked. She mixed concrete and carried lumber and made coffee on the camp stove for the crew in the mornings, which she suspected was her most valued contribution on certain days, but which she offered without irony because it was useful, and usefulness was what mattered. Her body, which had begun adapting in the first weeks, continued adapting. By June, she had arms that were different from the arms she'd had in November. Her hands were permanently rough in a way that no amount of lotion would entirely address, which she found she did not mind. She had lost close to 20 pounds from sustained physical work and regular, modest eating, and her clothes no longer fit in the way of the life she had left behind. She bought new ones in hard, practical things, work clothes, mostly jeans that would survive, a worksite flannel shirts, good boots. She bought one dress, dark green. She hung it on the hook behind the cabin door and looked at it occasionally and did not yet know what she was keeping it for. One evening in July, Cecily drove up from Fort Collins unannounced. She arrived in the early evening when the light on the mountains was at its particular summer gold, and the clearing smelled of cut lumber and pine resin and the faint mineral tang that came from the spring when the wind was right. She parked beside Miriam's car and stood looking at the property for a moment before she saw her mother on the roof of the nearly completed bathhouse, walking the perimeter and checking the flashing. Miriam climbed down. They stood in the clearing, and Cecily looked at the cabin, at the bathhouse structure, at the new porch across the front of the cabin that was simple and straight and solid, at her mother. She looked at her mother for a long moment. She said, "Mom, you did all this." Miriam said, "Not all of it. I had help." Cecily shook her head slowly. She looked like she was trying to reconcile two different images: the woman she had been worrying about for 6 months and the woman standing in front of her with a level tan and paint on her forearms and a measuring tape clipped to her belt. She could not quite make them fit together, and her face showed the process of trying. They sat on the new porch and talked until it was too dark to see the mountains. Cecily talked about her marriage, which was good but complicated in the way that most real things are. She talked about the children, her own two, who were at an age that required everything. She talked about how strange it had been to watch her parents' marriage end, and how strange it had been not to know how to help her mother-in-law, and how guilty she still felt about the guest room offer and the word temporary. Miriam listened without interrupting. Then she said, "You didn't fail me. You were living your life. That's what I raised you to do." Cecily said, "I thought you were falling apart." Miriam looked out at the clearing where the bathhouse stood in the last of the light. She said, "I did fall apart, just not the way you were expecting." The magazine article was not something Miriam had sought. A writer for a regional publication called Colorado Life had come to Harwick working on a piece about the revival of small mountain communities, and had heard about the woman up the hill who was restoring a 19th century mineral spring property. She had called Miriam and asked if she could visit. Miriam had said yes because saying no seemed like an unnecessary complication. The writer spent a day at the property in August, walking the grounds, sitting on the porch and asking questions. She was in her 30s, thorough, and had the quality of a good listener, asking follow-up questions that showed she had heard the previous answer. She asked about the cabin, about the cedar box, about the documents from 1875. She asked about the divorce, which Miriam answered directly because the divorce was part of the story, and pretending otherwise would make the story incomplete. The article ran in September, "From Divorce Settlement to Mountain Miracle." One woman's reclamation was the headline. The text was generous and specific, with photographs: the cabin before and after the thermal circle in winter snow, the bathhouse under construction, the cedar box and its documents laid out on the work table, and Miriam herself standing in the clearing in her work clothes with the mountains behind her. She looked at the photographs of herself for a long time. She had not looked at a photograph of herself in a long time. The woman in the photographs had gray hair, completely gray. Now she had stopped coloring it sometime in February, when it had seemed like the least important thing, and tanned skin and lines around her eyes that were different from the lines she'd had before, earned differently. She looked in the photographs like someone who had been somewhere, not like someone who had been comfortable for 40 years and then lost everything, like someone who had been somewhere and come back from it carrying something new. She put the magazine on the table and then went back to work. Within 2 weeks of the article running, her phone was receiving calls and messages from numbers she didn't recognize. Some were people with professional interest: an interior designer who specialized in wellness properties, a consultant who worked with spa operators in the Mountain West, an investor who wanted to talk about development possibilities. But most were from women. Women who had read the article and wanted to write to her, call her, find some way to tell her that what she had done meant something to them. Women in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s. Women who had been through divorces and were trying to figure out what came after. Women who were in marriages that were wearing them down and hadn't yet decided what to do about it. Women who felt invisible in ways they couldn't quite articulate until they read about a woman who had been told directly that she was invisible and had responded by building something that could not be ignored. Miriam read every message. She responded to most of them. She understood a symbol. She was a 63-year-old woman who had been handed a ruin and had made something useful from it, and if that meant something to people, she was glad it meant something. But she did not want it to become abstract. She did not want the story to become larger than the reality, which was there was a spring in the ground that had been waiting 150 years, and she had found it, and now it was going to be used for what it was intended for. Everything else was secondary. She started the blog in October. She called it Rebuilding at 63, which was straightforward and accurate and not particularly designed to be appealing, but which apparently appealed anyway. She wrote the way she talked, directly without embellishment, about what she was doing and how she was doing it and what was hard and what was harder. She wrote about the physical reality of the work, what it felt like to wake up with her arms aching every morning for a month until the aching stopped, what she had learned about roofing that she wished she had learned 30 years ago, what it was like to discover that she was capable of things she had never been given a reason to discover she was capable of. She wrote once about the anger, about what it had felt like to carry it in the early weeks, and what it had felt like to notice gradually that the anger was being replaced by something else, not peace exactly, but purpose. About the difference between those two things. That post was shared 40,000 times in the first week. By November, a year after the divorce had been finalized, the blog had 50,000 followers. The spa opened on a Saturday in early November. 3 private soaking rooms, each one built into the floor, in the style of a traditional mineral bath, accessed through a short path from the restored cabin that served as a reception and waiting area. The wood stove was lit. There were towels folded on wooden shelves Miriam had built herself. The water came from the spring through a simple system of pipes entering each room at the appropriate temperature. The mineral smell faint but present, the particular scent of water that has traveled a very long way through very old rock. She had taken bookings for the first month already. Word from the article from the blog from the small but focused community that had assembled around both. She had set the capacity deliberately low appointments, only limited numbers. The kind of experience that required quiet and time rather than throughput. This was not a commercial calculation. It was the right way to do it. The first guests arrived at 10 in the morning, 2 women sisters in their 60s who had driven from Denver. They had read the article. One of them had been through her own divorce 5 years ago and had told her sister that she needed to see this place. They stood in the clearing and looked at the canyon and the bathhouse and the mountains in the November light. And the one who had been through the divorce said nothing for a moment and then said, "You made all of this." Miriam said the spring was already here. "I just paid attention to it." The woman looked at her. She understood that they were talking about more than the spring. In the weeks that followed, Miriam fell into a rhythm different from the solitary rhythms of the construction months. Guests arrived soaked left. Some were quiet and wanted to be left alone, which she respected. Some wanted to talk, and she sat with them on the porch when the weather allowed, or at the table inside when it didn't, and she listened. The women who came were carrying things. Not always the same things: divorce, widowhood, illness. The particular grief of children who had grown into adults who no longer seemed to need you. The disorientation of retirement. The slow erosion of feeling visible in a world that oriented itself around youth. They were carrying things the way you carry things when you have been carrying them for a long time and have stopped noticing how heavy they are until you set them down somewhere briefly and feel the difference. Miriam listened. She did not offer advice unless it was asked for. She had learned in the months at the cabin that listening was a more useful thing than she had given it credit for being. She had spent 40 years managing organizing, providing competent, present, effective. She had not always been still enough to simply receive what someone else needed to put down. She was learning to be still. One afternoon in December, a woman named Phyllis arrived alone. She was 71, recently widowed, after 52 years of marriage, and she had driven up from Pueblo after reading the blog and deciding she needed to go somewhere that was not her house, which felt like a museum to a life that no longer existed. She sat with Miriam on the porch in the cold afternoon and said, "I don't know who I am without him. I was his wife for so long that I forgot the rest of it, whatever the rest was." Miriam looked at the mountains for a moment. Then she said, "Then this is a good place to start remembering. The rest doesn't disappear. It just gets quiet when something louder is happening. When the loud thing ends, you can hear it again." Phyllis was quiet. Then she said, "How long did it take you?" Miriam thought about it honestly. She said, "I'm still working on it. I think that might be the point." Phyllis left 2 hours later. She hugged Miriam at the car, the firm, brief hug of someone who doesn't usually hug strangers, but has decided this is an exception. She said she would come back in the spring. Miriam said she would be here. He came on a Thursday. Douglas's car appeared at the bottom of the track on a Thursday afternoon in December, about 13 months after the divorce had been finalized. Miriam was in the clearing talking with Pruitt about the drainage modification she wanted done before spring, and she saw the car turn off the county road and begin the 10-minute climb up the track through the trees. She recognized the car. She watched it come. Pruitt said something. She said she'd finish the conversation later and walked toward the clearing's entrance to wait. Douglas got out slowly. He was wearing a good coat, wool dark gray, which she didn't recognize either. He had aged in 13 months in the way that men age when something they counted on to stay in place does not stay in place. His face was thinner. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets and looked around the clearing at the cabin with its new porch and repaired roofline at the path leading to the bathhouse at the signage she had put up plain, lettered wood on a post, Callaway Mineral Spring, established 1875, restored 2024. He looked at all of it for a long moment. He looked at Miriam. She waited. There was no Sabrina. She had noticed this immediately. She did not ask about it. He said, I read the article. She said, I know. It ran 2 months ago. He said, I didn't know it had any value. The property. When I gave it to you, I genuinely believed it was worthless. Miriam said, you believe that because you never looked at it. You had it for 20 years and you never looked at it. He started to say something about how he'd been busy, how the business had demanded everything, how he couldn't be expected to investigate every inherited. She said, I'm not asking you to justify it. I'm telling you what happened. He stopped. She looked at him across the clearing. This man, she had shared 40 years with this man who had sat across from her in the living room and told her she had become invisible. She was not angry standing there. The anger had served its purpose and moved on the way useful things do when the work they were meant to do is done. What she felt instead was something simpler and more final. She felt clear. Douglas said, Sabrina and I are no longer together. It ended in August. She heard this. She absorbed it. She felt nothing in particular about it. He said the business has had some difficulties. The real estate market in the past year has been there, have been some losses, some significant ones. She said, I'm sorry to hear that. He said, I've been thinking that perhaps there's an argument to be made. My lawyer has suggested that because this property was part of the marital estate at the time of the divorce, Miriam said, stop. He stopped. She let the silence sit for a moment. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the clearing. Somewhere below the creek was audible running over the rocks it had been running over since before any of them existed. She said, Douglas, listen to what you came here to do. You gave me this property in a courtroom with your lawyer smiling beside you. You called after me as I was leaving and told me to try not to freeze. You handed me what you believed was nothing, and you laughed about it. And now you're here because it turned out to be something, and you'd like a portion of what I built from it. He said, I understand how that sounds. She said, I spent 40 years making myself smaller so that there would be more room for you. I managed everything so that you could manage your career. I raised our children and maintained our home and made the life that you lived in, and none of that was counted when the lawyers divided things up because it didn't produce a number that could be written in a column. She paused. I'm not angry about that anymore, but I am done. I was done in that parking lot outside the courthouse, and I am still done now. Douglas looked at the ground. When he looked up, his face had the particular expression of a man confronting a version of events that he had been avoiding confronting. He said, I made a mistake with you, with everything. She said, I know you did. He said, I don't know how to fix it. She said, I'm not sure it needed fixing so much as acknowledging. And I think you just did that. She looked at him steadily. He was 67 years old and tired in a way that had nothing to do with the drive up the mountain. He had the look of a man who had won and then discovered that what he'd won wasn't what he'd thought it was. She said, I hope you find your way through whatever comes next. I mean that. He nodded slowly. She said, but I can't be part of it. Not anymore. She said it the way you say a thing that has been true for a long time and is only now being spoken aloud, not with heat, not with ceremony, just with the flatness of a fact that doesn't require emphasis because it is simply true. Douglas stood for a moment longer. He looked once more around the clearing at the thing she had made from the thing he had thrown away. Then he walked back to his car and got in and drove back down the track through the trees. Miriam watched him go this time, not because she wanted to, not because she needed the visual confirmation, but because she was done with turning away from things with managing her sight lines to avoid what was difficult. She watched him until the car disappeared into the trees, and then she stood in the clearing for a moment in the cold December air, and then she went back to find Pruitt and finished the conversation about drainage. By spring, the rhythm of the place was established. Guests arrived by appointment. The blog had grown past 50,000 followers and was receiving messages daily from women who were rebuilding, from women who were considering it, from women who simply needed to read something true, from someone who had been where they were and come out somewhere worth being. Miriam wrote when she had something to say. She never wrote when she didn't. She had found that honesty required selectivity. Not everything needed to be shared, but what was shared needed to be real. The readers seemed to understand this. The community that had gathered around the blog was not interested in performance. They had enough performance in their lives. They wanted the thing underneath. Garrett came in April with his family, his wife, their 2 children, the younger one at an age where everything interesting was on the ground, and the older one at the age where everything important was whatever the adults were doing. He walked the property with Miriam and looked at the bathhouse and looked at the cabin and said, "Dad didn't see this. He had it for 20 years and he looked at it and saw nothing." Miriam said he saw what he expected to see. Garrett said, "How did you see something different?" She thought about this for a moment. She said, "I didn't have the option of seeing nothing. Nothing wasn't available to me anymore." He was quiet for a while. He said, "Are you happy up here, really?" She looked at the property, the clearing, the pines, the path to the bathhouse, the cabin with its new porch and its old bones. She looked at the mountains beyond the tree line, still snow-capped in April, going on in every direction as far as she could see. She said, "I'm something better than happy. I'm useful. And I'm myself. I don't think I've been both of those things at the same time before." That evening, after Garrett's family had driven back down the mountain, Miriam sat on the porch with a glass of wine and watched the sun go down behind the mountains. The sky went from blue to gold to the particular pink that high altitude produces when conditions are right, and then to a purple that deepened gradually toward dark. The stars appeared one at a time, the way they always did at this elevation, more of them, and brighter than any city sky allows. She thought about Elias Brandt, who had put his documents in a cedar box and built a false wall and written a note saying he would return. She thought about all the hands the property had passed through in the century and a half between his time and hers, all the men who had looked at it and seen nothing worth paying attention to. She thought about a courtroom in November and a check for negligible value and a voice calling after her, "Try not to freeze." She had not frozen. She had done the opposite of freezing. She had moved steadily toward everything that was difficult and cold and demanding, and the movement itself had generated the warmth she needed to keep going. She poured the last of the wine and looked at the stars. The blog post she would write the next morning was already forming in her mind. She had learned to let them form before she wrote them, to let the words find their shape in the quiet before she committed them to the screen. This one was about Elias Brandt, about the man who had believed in something enough to document it carefully and seal it away against the possibility that the right moment would arrive later. About what it meant to trust that the right moment would come even when you would not be there to see it. About what she owed to the cedar box and the woman who had needed to find it. She did not write it that night. That night she sat on the porch she had built herself and looked at the mountains and let the dark come down around the cabin that had been waiting for her and felt in the silence that was nothing like the silence of loss, the specific satisfaction of a person who has found the thing they were meant to do and is doing it. She was 64 years old. She had a spring in the ground that had been patient for a century and a half. She had a cedar box on a shelf inside that she would never put back in a wall. She had a porch she had built and a fire she could lay and a list of what needed doing next that was manageable and real. She had women writing to her from all over the country who needed to hear that it was possible. She had a daughter who was asking harder questions of her own life, a son who was looking at things with different eyes, grandchildren who would know a grandmother who had built something with her hands. She had the mountains which had been there before all of it and would be there after, and which did not require anything from her except that she pay attention. She had paid attention. In the morning, she would wake up and make coffee at the table she had built and look out the window she had repaired at the clearing she had reclaimed, and she would begin another day of the life she had made from the ruins of the life she had lost. It was, she thought, more than enough. It was, in fact, everything.